Hello children, this is your lesson for English Literature, Class 7. The topic is The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. It is a poem. So let's start with the introduction of the poem. The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a famous American poet. He began to publish poems at the age of 13. After finishing school and college, he became a professor of modern languages at the age of 22. 7 years later, in 1836, he became a professor at Harvard. In 1854, Longfellow gave up his job and devoted all his time to writing poetry. In 1879, near the end of his life, Longfellow wrote The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls, a short poem that is now one of his most famous. The poem is a good example of Longfellow's view of life as a somewhat sad but purposeful journey. So Longfellow was a very popular poet of his time in America. You can compare him to the pop singers of our times. He was that kind of famous. His poetry was read by almost in every household around evening by the fireside. So he was one of the group of poets that were called fireside poets or fire poets, because their poetry was read at a family time, in the family evening, near the fireside, and everyone listened to the poetry. So that is why you must be wondering why he left his job as a Harvard professor, such a good job, to become a poet, full-time poet. So that is why. So after this introduction, let's move on to difficult words and meaning that you are going to find in this poem. So the words are twilight. Twilight is the time when the sun is about to set, the soft light in the sky just after the sun has set. Curlew, it is the name of a large wading bird active in the night time. Hasten, move or travel hurriedly. Efface means to erase. Morning breaks, here morning breaks means the time of dawn. It can also mean rebirth. Steeds mean horses. Stalls are the places where horses are kept. Neigh is the sound made by a horse. Hostler, one who looks after the horses. And the day returns means the day begins again. And here it can also mean new life begins again. So, after the word meaning, we are now ready to start reading the poem. Now, this poem is in your Oxford Reading Circle book on page 43. If you have your books with you, you can open up page 43. So, let's start reading. The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town. And the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands. And the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks. The steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh. as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore. And the tide rises, the tide falls. So we have read the poem. So after reading the poem, what we can learn is that in this poem we have 3 stanzas. Each stanza is made up of 5 lines, and there are 15 lines altogether. The speaker of the poem is speaking in third person. It is the poet himself. The poem is a lyrical one. It's emotional and it has a rhyming pattern. And the theme of the poem is that the tide rises and the tide falls, and that we should live our life to the fullest and never give up. Longfellow also includes a lot of nature in it. Now the last point is about the rhyme scheme. Longfellow split the poem into 3 stanzas to represent the passing of time. He used rhyme scheme to create a flow when reading the poem and to establish a structure, and the rhyming scheme is A, B, B, A. So how do we determine the rhyming scheme? When we look at a poem, we see the last word, how the poem is rhyming. The first verse and the second verse rhyme. The last words have the same sound, falls, calls. So we represent them with the same letter, A. Now the third line, fourth line, these are rhyming together. The last sounds are same, brown, town. So we assign them another letter, B. So the same rhyming lines get the same letters. So these lines 1 and 2 get the letter A. Lines 3 and 4 get the letter B. And since the last line of the stanza, line 5, also rhymes with lines 1 and 2, so line number 5 also gets the same letter A. So the rhyming scheme is A, B, A. And this rhyming scheme is repeated in all the stanzas. Here also, A, B, A. A, B, A. So this is how we determine the rhyming scheme of a poem. Okay, so we have seen that the rhyming scheme is A, B, A. And now let's move on to the explanation. We are going to explain the poem stanza wise and line wise. So starting with the first stanza, the first 2 lines are: the tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. So we see that the poem begins with the description of the scene. The scene is that of a seaside. Because of the mention of the line, the tide rises, the tide falls. The sun has just sunk and the sky is getting darker. Because of the twilight scene is there, the word twilight shows that the sun is setting. And it shows that twilight is darkening, it is getting darker. The sky is getting darker. The next phrase, the curlew calls. The curlew are birds which are active in the night time. So these birds are now seen on the beach. In the daytime they were not there, but now as the sky is getting darker, the birds have arrived. Their calls are heard beside the sound of the beach waves. So now we see the scene of growing darkness means the quick arrival of something. This can also show the end of the day. The sun has just set, the night has started, the work of the day is finished, and whatever time is left now, very little light is left. and it will soon be gone, and whatever work of day is left must be finished up quickly before the night comes. The arrival of the curlew bird on the beach shows that the night is just about to start, and the call by the curlew bird seems that like they are announcing that the night time is on hand and everyone should hurry up. Now, I have told you what I have learned from these lines. This is my understanding. So, maybe you agree with me, maybe you not. Because when you are reading a poem, everyone can understand it differently. Everyone has a different mood, a different understanding, different emotions. So when you are reading a poem, your understanding can be slightly different from one another. So this explanation that I am giving is just for reference. Think for yourself. You might agree with me, you might agree not. So whatever is that you are understanding, it is right. When we are studying a poetry, do not think of right and wrong. Okay? So though I am giving you the explanation, keep your minds open and think for yourself also. So now the next lines 3 to 5 of stanza 1 are: along the sea sands damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Now we see that there is a traveler walking along the shore. The shore is called the sea sands, which happens to be damp and brown. The tide has fallen, but the sand on the beach is still wet, and due to the growing darkness, the sand which shone golden in the daylight now appears brown. He is hurrying towards a nearby town. Maybe he lives there. Maybe he is just tired and worn down and wants to get to an inn to rest for the night. The ending of the day, the arrival of night, with the traveler hurrying towards town, can mean the arrival of death. The end of daylight can mean the end of life, and the hurrying traveler going towards a place of rest can mean that the life of the traveler is almost over, and now he is going towards his or her eternal rest. He or she is now old, and death is imminent like the night. No one can stop the night from coming, just as no one can stop a death from coming. So the rise and fall of the tide were just a metaphor for life itself. Metaphor means a depiction, a symbol, something to show something by. So here, the rising and falling of the tide means the coming and going of life itself. So life goes on just like the tides. They rise and fall in their rhythmic pattern, and so does time go on, and traveler or man has only a day, a lifetime, and when night, we can say death comes, they must go to their place of rest. That can be a grave. So let's move on now to stanza number 2. The first two lines of stanza 2 are lines 6 and 7. These are: darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. Now the scene is changed. From the darkening twilight, we have now moved to the dark night itself. Line 6 tells that darkness is settled on the roof and walls. It is night time now. It can mean that all activity in the town has stopped. Line 7 starts with "but the sea." This can mean that although everything has stopped working, the sea is still active. Let's consider first what is the significance of sea in the poem. We have seen that the tide rise shows the arrival of life. The fall of the tide means death. The sea which gives rise to these tides could be that the poet is showing that the sea is the source of life itself. So line 7 then continues with the sea in the darkness calls. First, but the sea, and then the sea in the darkness calls. The sea's calling could mean a few different things. It could mean that the speaker is just describing the sound of the tide rising and falling. Like, the sea is not a person. The sea cannot call someone by its name. But here the poet has used another metaphor. We call this personification. When something that is not a person is made to sound like it is a person, it is given a personality. So here the sea is made to be like a person which is calling someone. Okay? So this could mean a few things. Maybe it is just the sound of the sea, or maybe the sea is calling the traveler, that a different life is waiting you beyond death. When you die, you will find something else, maybe eternal life or something. So there can be these two meanings, or maybe you have thought of another one. Have you? Okay, now let's move on to the next lines. These are lines 8 to 10 of the second stanza. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Now let's start with those soft white hands. Soft white hands, the little waves. We are dealing with personification again, as the sea doesn't really have soft white hands. The waves do not have hands. So this is again speaker's way of saying that sea is gentle and kind and soft. The waves have soft hands. And now we come to the footprints in the second line. They probably belong to the traveler, who you recall was on his way back to the town the last time we saw him. So the traveler has left the shore, he's heading back to town, and in the meantime, the soft, gentle ocean has effaced, has washed away his footprints. The ocean waves are erasing or effacing all the footprints that have been left by the traveler. Maybe it's this traveler, or maybe some other traveler's footprints in the sand. This could mean that when the traveler or any human has gone, has died, the waves, which could mean time here, they erase the memory of the ones that are gone away. So the traveler has left the shore. Now all of the evidence that he was ever there is completely gone. It's pretty clear now that the speaker is talking about death now. The footprints are a metaphor again for the evidence of life, and the tide wiping them away takes away that sign of life. And so it is a metaphor for the passing of time, for death. It's almost like every single trace of the traveler's existence is completely eradicated. And yet life simply goes on. Because of the last line of the stanza, we can think that life continues no matter what happens. How can we not think that when the speaker concludes the second stanza by saying just that, and the tide rises, the tide falls. So after life, death comes, but that is not all, for life begins again after death, and so the cycle continues. The tide rises and falls, but rises again, and it keeps going on. So now we come to the last stanza. The first two lines, lines 11 and 12 are, the morning breaks, the steed in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. After the twilight and the darkness and the footprints being erased, the dawn comes again. The morning breaks, which is just like saying the dawn breaks. The morning comes. The emergence of the morning is yet another metaphor for a symbol of rebirth, of new life. So while the morning is emerging, the horses are stamping and neighing in their stalls, and their hostler is calling. Much like the sea in the first stanza, Is he calling to the horses, to somebody else? Again, it's not clear. Probably to the horses, getting them ready for the work. Notice how even though the traveler is likely no longer with us, there are other people and animals still alive and kicking. The hostler and those horses. So this is speaker's subtle way of saying that life does indeed go on. Though the rising and falling of the tide is the central image in the poem, other patterns and cycles are also present. The sun sets and rises repeatedly, just like the tide. People come and go, everybody dies. To put it another way, the tide rises, the tide falls. Okay. Now, lines 13 and 15. The day returns but never more, returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. A new day has started, all the activities of the day are in full swing, everything has begun life once again, just like yesterday. The only difference is that the traveler has not returned to the beach. It is because he has died, and he will never be seen again. And life will go on as before, following its predictable pattern. Here the speaker is repeating the idea which is he's portrayed in the morning breaks. He expresses the same idea in slightly different terms with the return of the day. All that nighttime stuff is a thing of the past. The traveler who will never return to life again, but still the life will go on without him. So, now we can summarize the poem. The summary is when you tell the whole story, when you shorten up the whole story and tell it in a short paragraph. So, whatever story we have read in the poem, now we can tell it in one paragraph. And if we try to do it, it would be something like this. You can try your own summary if you want. Maybe you can shorten it a bit more, or you can elongate it. But it should be short. So, a summary could be like, this poem describes a seaside scene. The tide rises and the tide falls. It's twilight, a bird is calling, and the traveler is leaving the shore heading for a nearby town. Now it's dark, nighttime has come, the sea is calling, and the waves erase the traveler's footprints from the shore. Despite this gloomy perspective, the dawn does come again. There are signs of life everywhere. Horses are ready and rearing to go. A hostler is calling out. Sure, the traveler will never return to the shore because he's dead. But the tide rises and then the tide falls. So here are a few questions. This time I have written the answers here, but please, the answers are not for copy pasting. They are just a reference. Like I said, in a poem, you understand what you feel like, maybe. Here are some questions. I have written the answers, but you might think of some other answer for them, because every answer that you can think for yourself is the correct one. Okay, this is not a text that you can find some facts and you can pick them out. Whatever you understand from the poem is your understanding and it is correct. Okay, so with this, let's start this question answer session. Okay, question: when was the tide rising and when was the tide rises and tide falls written? Now this is a fact. In 1879, near the end of his life, Longfellow wrote The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls, a short poem that is now one of his most famous. Where is the traveler going in the poem? The tide rises, the tide falls. Like, we can see that the traveler is going towards a town. He's going to rest somewhere. So I think that answer would be enough. So, what does the rising and falling of the tide represent? You can write a simple enough answer like, the rising and falling of the tide represent the coming and going of life, or the life cycle of every human being on the planet is shown with the rising and falling of the tides. So whatever you understand, or you can say the rising and falling of the tide represents life and death. Next question: what happens to the traveler in The Tide Rises the tide falls. We can see that now it is dark, the sea is calling, the waves erase the traveler's footprints from the shore. Despite this gloomy perspective, the dawn does come again. The traveler will never return to the shore. So this shows the life of a person, how it began its life, it did its work, and now it is ending. What is the tone of the tide rises, the tide falls? The tone is the mood. What do you feel when you read a poem? Some poems are humorous. When you read them, you feel happy. Some are love poems. You feel a different kind of mood, different kind of feelings evoke in you. So when you read this poem, what kind of feelings were there? So the tone in the poem starts out as cold, dark tone, and then it shifted into a peaceful, calm, relaxed tone towards the end. In the beginning, there was a traveler and we were told that he has died, so it was kind of depressing, sad. But in the end, we were shown that life continues, so it became relaxed. So, next question. Why do you think the poet uses the word sea sand rather than the beach? So it is just another meaning for the word beach. Sea sands, that's it. Okay, what word other than those in the title are repeated in the poem, and what significance do they have? We see that the title, the tide rises, the tide falls, is repeated in the poem. In every stanza it comes. And besides these, we have found that there is the word calls, which is repeated, which has come in all the three stanzas. In stanza 1, the curlew calls. In stanza 2, the sea is calling. And in the third stanza, the hostler is calling. So these can have different meaning. You can think for yourself. To me, the curlew is maybe telling the traveler to hurry up. He's telling that death is coming, finish up your work, hurry up. Now the sea is maybe he's calling someone towards God. Your life is ending. Now you have to go and meet your maker. And the hostler's call could mean it's a call for the people in the world that they have to complete their journey, they have to fulfill their purpose of life. Now next question, what is Longfellow saying about nature with his repetition of the lines, the tide rises, the tide falls? Now again, you can write whatever answer, you can answer it in whatever way you feel like I can say. It means the life cycle of every person, or it means just life and death. Next question, what is the rhyme scheme of the poet? We had already discussed the rhyming scheme of the poem. So the rhyming scheme is A, B, B, A. Okay, last we come to the message of the poem. The message is, what is the central idea, or what is one thing that you can think of after reading the whole poem? What is the one thing that the poet is trying to say through the poem? So you can write this, you can say it in one or two lines, sentences. One or two sentences is enough to tell the message of the poem. So here you can say that the message of the poem is that life is not permanent, it follows death, and we should do our work as we should not waste time, we should fulfill our purpose of life as long as we are here. So whatever you feel like, that is the message of poem. Here I have written a few lines like, in life we too live and die, we are replaced by someone, but life doesn't stop. Okay, after the message, now we come to the homework. You have to do exercise A, B, C, D and E, lots of exercises from book pages 45 and 47 in your English literature copy. Your work will be checked and marks will be awarded when you resume school. Now remember, you have to do only question 1 of exercise D and question 1 of exercise E only. So here are the book pages. Now remember, you have to do this exercise D in your book only. Do not do this in your copy. Do it in your book and do it with a light pencil. Okay. So this is the end of the lesson. The poem, The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. Thank you. Keep studying at home. Bye-bye.